It's a study on peace building in Indonesia, and it can teach. And what she's looking at is what it can teach us about inculcating cultural wisdom into the workplace. And the questions here are, or the question here is, what are the effects of socio-demographic factors on ethnic tolerance and religious tolerance, as well as the participation of the local community in peace building and post-ethnic violent conflicts in this multicultural society? And the methods of this study was a survey designed to specifically determine relationships between the socio-demographic variables and ethnic tolerance, religious tolerance, and the level of participation in peace building. A total of 500 respondents were surveyed. There's 2 villages that had experienced ethnic conflict that were selected from each district, and 50 respondents were randomly selected from each of them. And they had in-depth interviews that were conducted with over 50 residents and 5 informants, the informants being community leaders, local police officers, or local military officers. And the results of this study were that the degree of tolerance is not determined by the socio-demographic characteristics of a region, and that ethnic tolerance affects religious tolerance. They also found a couple fascinating insights about one's education not affecting the degree of ethnic tolerance or religious tolerance, their ability to, be ethnically tolerant or religiously tolerant, and the level of that. Cultural segregation influences intolerant views, which makes it more permissive for violent behavior. And then the sociocultural approach based on local wisdom was the main strategy used in peace building. And what this was is they had these kind of ancient wisdom concepts that were embraced by multiple communities in Indonesia. And she listed a few of them here, but they were essentially the primary peace building, I guess, kind of posture efforts that were used to end violent conflict in this post-ethnic and religious multicultural society. And so Audipria related this to the workplace in a number of ways for a key takeaway, and that was to inculcate diversity training and messaging in education. Since the authors included that one's level of education doesn't necessarily ensure that they will be free from biases and prejudice. They say a workplace must take it upon itself to educate its employees frequently about social norms that help advance better teamwork, cooperation, and inclusion. And she also tapped into this key takeaway that we need to tap into sociocultural wisdom, and that can be helpful for peace building and conflict resolution efforts. His sociocultural factors were one of the main forms of post-conflict reconciliation. The author referred to ancient wisdom traditions from within the Indonesian culture that helped their society achieve some levels of peace. And at a workplace, an important way of embracing diversity is to inculcate wisdom from the various cultures that the employees come from as far as possible. So implementing, she mentioned implementing some sort of activities, often, mixing in groups and out groups of the organization, all of that, and kind of learning about each other, getting to know the other person better that's different from you, letting go of your assumptions, that can help kind of through this sociocultural wisdom method that can help increase inclusion and diversity and inclusion in the workplace. And so, I found this study interesting. I wanted to see what I wanted to learn a little bit more about the like wisdom traditions that they were using to peace build in this area. And so I'm going to look at that now, but I'm interested to see what you all think of this as well.
Yeah, actually, I was that last bullet of the results that kind of stuck out to me the most too, and it made me think of looking at kind of international peacekeeping. We've talked about this before, right? With like UN peacekeepers, a lot of times they will sort of employ local citizens in post-conflict societies, post-war societies to enact the peace building initiatives because it's bound to kind of have a better results in the end when it's coming from like the local community, right? I mean, the ground up approach. And then so taking that into the into the workplace, as Anupriya points out, I feel like that's a really valuable point, is not, understanding the diversity in the room, but then actually like having people kind of share from their understanding of their cultural norms, and having that be sort of a way to almost create a new cultural norm of that specific group, even if it is a mix of different people, but like having their own like personal cultural norms being brought into the workplace could help.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So this made me think about how, and I've seen documentaries and read a few things about it, but like to try to deal with gang violence in certain inner city communities, they don't like just send someone from the outside in necessarily. They go in and they work with leaders of the groups of the gangs,
Mm.
and they'll take like two, of the more powerful ones, and start with them, and then they're able to go and influence the members of their gangs, members of their communities, and that kind of thing. And so that's just sort of what this reminded me of, because I think that that's probably the only way. Like, some people are only going to listen to the people that they identify with, um, and it makes sense. It absolutely makes sense. The education thing, though, that surprises me a little bit. It's because, at least here, we like to think that people that are more educated are more open. And so I wonder if the same study would come up with the same results here, or, I don't know.
Interesting. I
Yep.
have two thoughts to Tony's feedback. So in response to like the local wisdom and that strategy of, how you speak of like gang violence, and having somebody kind of within that identifies within that be sort of the teacher in peace building.
Mm-hmm.
That to me sounds like a restorative approach, right? A restorative practices, and it reminds me of post-genocide Rwanda, right, where they use the practice of gacaca, similar to kind of the indigenous way of circle processes. So gacaca was kind of bringing in the local community to sort of not only restore and rebuild the relationships that were broken between Tutsi and Hutus, but also playing that like the legal role. It was a court system,
Right.
but a court system designed not just to penalize, but to restore.
To restore.
Yeah, and so that it kind of just reminds me a lot of that. And then your other notion of the education, I feel like I see that a lot in the United States of America, where like my thoughts, this study kind of validates my thoughts, right? As education doesn't necessarily mitigate our understanding of bias and prejudice, because we all study different things, right? I mean, education,
That's
like
true.
intelligence, is so vast and enormous, right? Like we, how many times do we work with clients that are, I mean, geniuses in certain industries and certain departments, but can't seem to grasp an understanding of seeing from another perspective, or seeing, understanding their own assumptions that are playing a role in the way they treat someone, right? So I feel like those, yeah, I don't know. I see that division, not division, but that gap there.
Yeah, I think I agree, Sarah. I think like, I don't know, I'm like, rationally you would think that as one becomes more educated, that they have, that affects their ethnic and religious tolerance. But I know a lot of people that, I know some people that went to Pepperdine, or I know people with masters or doctorates that, are not super religiously tolerant. And so I just, I agree. I think it's the level of education. It depends on, like, you're right. It's such a vast sphere of knowledge. And, I feel like it probably relates a lot more to, it might relate a lot more to the amount of wealth that you have, or other certain demographic factors. Because when I think of, I mean, you could, I imagine, like, in the US, like, think about religious tolerance. If you're growing up in a like majority Christian area, and then you go to a Christian college, and then you go to a Christian master school, and you're probably not going to be super, and all of these have certain theological or certain frameworks about them. That's not going to change your religious tolerance maybe towards other religions, if depending on how you personally are interpreting everything. But I don't know. I think you're right. That's all to say. I think that you made a good point there. And it looks like we lost Tony.
Yeah, I saw that she was frozen, so something must have happened technology wise.
Yeah.
I as far as like the educational kind of take from this study, it reminds me of, like, I think it was Albert Einstein who said this. I'm not sure. He said that everyone is a genius at something that you're not. And I feel like I've embedded that into my brain too, to understand, not to understand, but to kind of, I don't know, like tolerate the various, like, knowledge that people have, and understanding that, like, no one knows everything. And just because you're a genius at, marketing and web development doesn't mean that you're a genius at communication or racial bias and all of those,
right.
religious tolerance. So just kind of staying aware of that, I feel like, helps us all to just be better people.
Yeah. Well, that makes me think of, I don't know, I get to the idea of, privilege and everything. And it makes me think of probably a lot of more wealthy white people who, just, and probably a lot of which are super educated, very, have master's, doctorates, bachelor's degrees. But, doesn't mean that they're educated in their privilege, or know about bias as much. And there's just a lot of other factors that make up that. So it makes sense that, education is not the primary, the primary factor that contributes. And it certainly can, but it's not the end all factor that contributes.
It depends what you're being educated on, right?
Yeah, right.
I feel like a lot of the other studies that we've gone through on our weekly research updates, there has been a trend of talking a lot about, biases and prejudices that influence the way that we act, right? In all different situations. But I feel like generally a big takeaway, generally speaking, has been to surround yourself and be exposed to differences. So surround yourself with different viewpoints, different ethnicities, different religions, different races, in order to kind of learn more about yourself and your own unconscious biases, and how you can sort of break those. So
right.
Yeah, I mean, being educated isn't the same as being, like, exposed and experiencing differences.
Right. Yeah, education doesn't mean, intergroup contact, talk, you're not necessarily going to meet or get to know these different cultures. I mean, you could, yeah, you're right. If you're going to study that, then you're probably going to learn about it quite a bit. And that's going to affect your degree of tolerance. But if you're studying economics, you got to put in the effort to learn about these other things if you want to, if you want to get better at them in some degree. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that makes sense, Sarah, because, like, with Noah's example of someone growing up in a Christian community and going to a Christian college, it may not be that they're not open to it. They just haven't been exposed to it as frequently as somebody else would have. So that makes perfect sense.
Right. Yeah, that's good.